The first thing you notice in the photograph is the scale of it. A field in western Wisconsin, frost still silvering the grass, and stacked across 4 acres are what look like the ruins of a wooden city. 4,200 broken apple crates, dumped in 1 week by 3 semi-trucks, piled higher than a man's head in some places, slouching sideways in others where the wood had already begun to rot. The neighbors called it an eyesore. The county called it a fire hazard. Deborah Halverson called it Tuesday. To understand why a 51-year-old woman would look at 4,200 broken crates and see anything other than a problem, you have to go back about 14 months. To the afternoon, the packing plant in Gilman, Wisconsin closed its doors for good. Deb had worked the sorting line at Gilman Fruit Packers for 19 years. It wasn't glamorous work. She graded apples for bruising and stem pull, 8 hours a day, in a building that smelled permanently of cold storage and cardboard. But it paid the mortgage on a 40-acre parcel she and her ex-husband had bought, back when they still believed things between them would work out. The divorce took the husband. The plant closing took the job. By the time she was 50, Deb was alone on 40 acres of marginal hay ground, with a barn that needed a new roof, and a checking account that told her, in blunt monthly language, that something had to change. The plant's closure left behind more than unemployed workers. It left behind the crates, the wooden bushel crates the orchards around Gilman had used for 60 years to move apples from tree to truck to packing line. Cheap plastic bins had mostly replaced them a decade earlier, but Gilman Fruit Packers had kept a warehouse of the old wooden ones as backup stock, thousands of them, stacked to the rafters and slowly forgotten. When the plant liquidated its assets, nobody wanted the crates. The scrap wood buyer who came through offered 11 cents apiece, and only for ones with no rot. The rest, split slats, broken corner blocks, crates that had been through 40 apple seasons and looked it. The liquidator just wanted gone. Gone fast, gone cheap, gone anywhere. Deb's 40 acres, sitting empty and visible from the county road, was the anywhere. She didn't ask for the crates. A man named Gary Felt, who'd handled the plant's liquidation, called her because he remembered she had land, and because, as he put it on the phone, "You always struck me as somebody who wouldn't make a stink about it." He offered her $400 to take delivery of what he estimated at 4,000 crates, no strings, do whatever she wanted with them, including burn them, which was in fact what most people expected would eventually happen. Her son thought she was out of her mind. Her neighbor, an 80-year-old dairy farmer named Carl Riska, drove over just to look at the pile and shake his head. "That's not a decision, Deb," he told her. "That's a fire pit, waiting on a match." The county zoning office sent a letter within 3 weeks, asking about her plans for waste wood storage, exceeding permitted volume. Everyone had the same reaction: get rid of it. What made Deb pause instead of calling the burn permit office was smaller and stranger than any grand vision. Walking the pile that first week, cataloging what she'd actually taken on, she noticed that the wood wasn't uniform garbage. Some slats were split beyond use, gray and soft with rot, but a good third of the crates were made from tight-grained old-growth pine and poplar, wood nobody cut anymore, seasoned outdoors through 60 Wisconsin winters, until it had a hardness and a color, a deep honeyed amber, that new lumber simply didn't have. The corner blocks, thick chunks of oak dovetailed into the frames for strength, were solid as the day they were cut. She'd spent 19 years grading apples for flaws. It turned out she was good at spotting which wood, underneath the dirt and staple holes, still had something in it. She didn't know what she'd do with it. She just didn't burn it. What she did instead, for about 4 months, was fail. The first failure came from simple impatience. Deb had seen, online, people making small side tables out of reclaimed crate wood, and she figured she could do the same. She pried apart a dozen crates, pulled the nails, and glued the slats edge to edge into a tabletop the same week she cut them, using ordinary wood glue and clamps borrowed from Carl Riska's shop. Within 10 days, the tabletop had cupped so badly it looked like a shallow bowl. She hadn't understood moisture content. The crate wood, stored outdoors for years, still held around 18 to 20% moisture, plenty dry to the touch, but far too wet to glue into a flat panel that wouldn't move. Wood doesn't stop breathing once it's cut. It keeps absorbing and releasing moisture with the air around it, expanding across the grain as it takes on humidity and shrinking as it dries. Glue two boards together before that movement has stabilized, and the panel will twist, cup, or crack along the glue line as the wood keeps adjusting to indoor conditions. She'd needed to bring the wood down to somewhere around 7 or 8% moisture, kiln dry or close to it, before it would sit still enough to be furniture. Her first 12 tables were firewood inside of 3 weeks. The second failure was about the staples and nails. Crates used dozens of small nails and, in later years, galvanized staples to hold the slats to the frame. Deb assumed she could just pull them with a claw hammer and cat's paw, the way you'd pull a nail from a fence board. What she learned, expensively, was that 70 years of oxidation had made many of those nails brittle, and pulling them wrong split the very grain she was trying to save. The good, tight, old wood cracking exactly where a fastener had sat for decades, weakening it invisibly along that line. Her second batch of 10 tabletops, this time properly dried over the summer under a tarp with sticker boards between the layers to let air move through, looked fine when she assembled them and started coming apart at the glue joints within a month, because half the boards had hairline splits from bad nail pulling that only showed up under stress. She ruined roughly 40 board feet of good pine finding this out, and started keeping every pulled nail in a coffee can, not for sentiment, but because counting them told her how many crates she was actually processing, and by extension, how slow the whole business really was going to be. The third failure was about finish, and it was the one that almost made her quit. She'd finally built a tabletop that held its shape, properly air-dried for nearly 4 months. Nails pulled with a flat pry bar worked from underneath instead of a claw, sanded to 120 grit. She put a dark walnut stain on it, expecting the old wood's grain to soak it up evenly the way new pine would. Instead it blotched, dark in some patches, pale in others, because the wood's density varied wildly board to board, some slats being tight old-growth pine, others softer sapwood from younger trees mixed into the original crates. Stain penetrates unevenly into wood with inconsistent density, and pine especially is notorious for blotching because its softer early wood grain drinks up stain far faster than its harder late wood grain. She'd sanded the whole surface, stained it once, and ended up with something that looked less like rustic character and more like a bad accident. She stripped it, resanded, and this time used a wash coat of thin shellac first, a thin sealing layer that partially closes the pores of the softer wood so the stain that follows sits more evenly across the whole board. It worked, but it took her 3 tries to get the shellac dilution right, and by the time she had one presentable tabletop to show for her efforts, it was late October and she had exactly $400 left from Gary Felt's payment and a barn full of nail cans. It was around then that Carl Riska, tired of watching her fumble, finally said something useful. Carl himself didn't do woodwork, but his late brother-in-law, a man named Elmer Voss, had run a small cabinet shop in Durand for almost 50 years before his hands got too arthritic to hold a chisel. Elmer was 78, lived alone since his wife passed, and had a reputation in 3 counties for being the best joiner anyone had ever hired and the least talkative man anyone had ever met. Carl called him. Elmer said he'd come look, but he made no promises about liking what he saw. Elmer Voss showed up in a pickup older than some of Deb's crates, walked the barn where she'd started stacking dry, denailed lumber by species and thickness, picked up 3 or 4 boards without saying anything, and studied a tabletop she'd finally finished for almost a full minute before he spoke. "You're building furniture like it's supposed to forgive you," he said. "It won't. Wood remembers everything you did to it." Then he told her, In maybe 40 words total across that first visit, 3 things that mattered more than anything she'd learned on her own. First, never work wood until it's been dried and stickered for at least as many months as the plank is thick in inches. A rule of thumb, roughly a year per inch, though air-dried lumber in a ventilated barn in Wisconsin's climate could get close in 6 to 8 months for the 1-inch crate stock she was working with. Second, sort every board by how it rings when you tap it before you decide what to do with it. A dull thud means hidden rot or a check running through the grain, even if the surface looks clean, and that board goes in the scrap pile no matter how good it looks. Third, and this was the one that stuck with her longest, don't build what you think people want. Build what the wood's already telling you it wants to be. At the time, she thought it was just an old man being cryptic. It would take her nearly 2 years to understand it as practical instruction rather than folk wisdom, but that's later. Elmer didn't offer to teach her formally, and he made it clear he wasn't running a charity. But he came back every couple of weeks that winter, mostly to needle her about her joinery. He taught her to cut a proper mortise and tenon instead of relying only on glue and screws, showing her that a well-fitted mortise and tenon joint, a tenon, the tongue cut on one board's end, fitted snugly into a mortise, a matching slot cut into the other, holds through decades of seasonal wood movement because the joint is mechanical, not just adhesive. Glue alone eventually fails as the wood expands and contracts, but a tight mechanical joint moves with the wood instead of fighting it. He taught her to read grain direction so her hand planes stopped tearing out chunks instead of leaving a clean surface, showing her how to tilt a board toward the light to see which way the grain ran uphill before running a blade against it. He never once told her the business would work. He mostly just kept showing up, correcting one specific thing at a time, the way you'd correct someone's grip on a tool rather than lecture them about craftsmanship in the abstract. Her first sale, when it finally came in December of that first year, was almost an accident. Carl Riska's daughter was getting married and needed a simple bench for the reception hall entrance, somewhere to set gifts. Carl mentioned Deb had built one out of old apple crates. The daughter, charmed by the story more than the object itself at first, paid $65 for it, barely covering Deb's time, let alone the months of failed lumber behind it. But she posted a photo of the cratewood bench, complete with the ghost outlines of stenciled orchard names, still faintly visible on one board, to a regional Facebook group for Wisconsin apple country nostalgia. The post got shared 400 times in a week. Deb got 11 messages asking if she made these for sale. She said yes before she had any idea how she'd fill 11 orders, and that gap between saying yes and being able to deliver taught her the next hard lesson, which was about scale. She'd been thinking of her operation as one woman and one barn. 11 orders for benches, small tables, and one hutch meant she needed roughly triple the dried lumber she had on hand, and drying takes months, not weeks. You cannot rush moisture out of wood without checking and cracking it. She underestimated how much usable lumber 4,000 crates would actually yield once you accounted for rot, snapped nails, and split boards. Her real yield, she learned that winter, was closer to 40% of the pile being usable structural lumber, another 20% good only for smaller accent pieces or shims, and the rest fit only for kindling. 4,200 crates sounded infinite. It was not. She had to slow her promises down, tell 3 of the 11 customers they'd be waiting until spring, and start keeping a waiting list, a literal notebook, at first, with names and dates. The next spring, she took 6 finished pieces to the Eau Claire Farmers Market, mostly benches and cutting boards made from the oak corner blocks, which were dense enough to survive knife work. She sold all 6 in one Saturday and took orders for 4 more. That summer, a woman running a farm-to-table restaurant in Menomonee saw the cutting boards at the market and asked if Deb could supply a standing order, a dozen boards a month, sized to the restaurant's prep stations, at a wholesale price lower than retail but guaranteed and recurring. This was Deb's first real lesson in consistency, and it cost her the account briefly before she learned it. Her second month's delivery ran 2 weeks late because she'd been focused on a bigger custom hutch order and let the restaurant's dozen boards slip down her list. The restaurant, needing reliable stock more than exceptional stock, quietly found another supplier for 2 months before coming back once Deb had proven, by then, that she could hold a schedule. She learned to run a simple production calendar after that, batches of cutting boards cut and glued on a fixed weekly rhythm regardless of what custom work was also on her bench, because standing orders paid steadier than one-off pieces, and losing one taught her they had to come first. From there, the growth was neither sudden nor mysterious. Each stage happened because the one before it had actually worked, and Elmer, when he saw it, would only ever say, "Good. Now don't get sloppy," which passed, from him, for high praise. The restaurant account led to 2 more restaurant accounts within the same year, all through word of mouth in a small regional network of chefs who talked to each other, and all wanting the same story, the ghost stencil marks of old orchard names on the wood, something no new lumber could fake. That demand pushed Deb to formalize how she sorted her inventory. She began keeping boards grouped not just by species and thickness, but by which crates still carried visible stenciling, since customers increasingly wanted at least one board or panel with a legible fragment of old orchard branding on it, something she'd once have sanded off without thinking twice. A garden center 40 miles away in Eau Claire saw her benches at the farmer's market and asked about wholesale terms for a line of smaller planter boxes, since cratewood already had the rustic association gardeners liked. Deb had to learn, fast, the difference between building one bench beautifully and building 30 planter boxes to a consistent size using a jig, a simple wooden guide clamped to her table saw and workbench that let her cut identical angles and lengths without measuring each piece by hand. Without the jig, her first batch of 15 boxes came out with small inconsistencies in width that made them wobble when stacked for display, and the garden center sent 4 back. Elmer, looking at the rejects, told her plainly that a one-off piece can have soul, but a wholesale order needs to be boring in its precision, and that those weren't opposites, they were 2 different jobs. She built her first real jig that week, and never freehand cut a repeated piece again. Online orders came next, almost sideways. A customer who'd bought a cutting board at the farmer's market posted about it on a broader woodworking and homesteading forum, and within a season, Deb had built a simple website. Nothing fancy, photographs taken in her own barn, a story about the 4,000 crates told plainly, and an order form. This is where her waiting list, once a notebook with 11 names, became something closer to an actual backlog, because online orders arrived faster than she could physically keep pace with drying and building. By her 3rd year, she was quoting new custom furniture orders, tables, hutches, larger commissioned pieces, at 11 months out, not because she was trying to seem exclusive, but because that was, plainly and honestly, how long it took her to dry new lumber, work through her existing list, and not compromise the process Elmer had drilled into her. She refused to shortcut the drying time, even when demand made it tempting, because she remembered exactly what a rushed tabletop looked like 10 days after it left her clamps. The biggest single commission came in her 4th year, when the town of Gilman itself, the same town whose packing plant had produced the crates in the first place, decided to build a small memorial park where the plant once stood, commemorating the orchard economy that had employed 3 generations of local families before consolidation and plastic bins ended it. The town council, several of whom remembered Deb from her 19 years on the sorting line, commissioned her to build the park's benches and a set of interpretive display cases using wood from the very crates the plant itself had discarded. It was, in the plainest possible way, the doubters coming around, not through any dramatic reversal, but because the wood had proven itself useful long enough that nobody thought to question it anymore. Gary Felt, the liquidator who'd offered her $400 to take an eyesore off his hands, came to the dedication and told a local reporter, half joking, that it was the best $400 he'd ever spent, that wasn't his own money. By then, Deb had processed nearly all 4,200 crates. She kept the coffee cans of pulled nails as a rough tally, and by her count, she'd pulled somewhere north of 60,000 of them over 4 years. She employed one part-time helper, a laid-off mill worker from a nearby town, who she trained the same slow way Elmer had trained her, one correction at a time, no lectures, mostly by making him tap boards and listen for the dull thud of hidden rot before he was allowed to cut anything. Elmer Voss died that same year, in his sleep, at 81, and Deb was one of maybe a dozen people at the funeral, held in the same Duran church where he'd been baptized. She thought, standing in the pews, about that first thing he ever told her, that wood remembers everything you did to it, and understood, finally, that he hadn't just been talking about lumber. Every piece she'd built carried the evidence of what she'd learned and what she'd rushed and what she'd fixed, visible if you knew how to look, the same way a person does. The waiting list, when a regional newspaper did a feature on her the following spring, stood at 11 months for custom furniture, 4 to 6 weeks for wholesale cutting boards and planters, and closed entirely for a period each winter while she caught up on drying stock for the following year. Her 40 acres, once mocked as a fire hazard waiting on a match, had a proper drying barn now, built with a real roof, stacked neat with sticker-piled lumber sorted by species, thickness, and how long each board had left before it was ready. She still keeps one crate whole, unopened, near the door of her shop, stenciled faintly with the words, Gilman Fruit Packers, Orchard Grade, not for sale, not for parts, just so that anyone walking in for the first time can see exactly what all 4,200 of them once looked like, and understand, the way she eventually did, that the difference between garbage and a livelihood was never really the material. It was the 11 months of patience nobody else was willing to give it. People still asked her, when they came out to the farm to pick up an order, or just to see the place after reading about it somewhere, why she hadn't just sold the land and the crates both, and let somebody else deal with the mess. She had an answer by then, worn smooth from repeating it, though it never came out sounding rehearsed. She'd tell them that in 19 years of grading apples, she'd learned to see flaws quicker than almost anyone, a bruise under the skin before it ever showed on the surface, a soft spot that would rot a whole bushel if you didn't pull the apple out in time. What she hadn't learned until the crates arrived was how to see the opposite of a flaw, the soundness still hiding inside something everyone else had already written off. It wasn't a skill anybody had taught her on the sorting line. It was closer to the thing Elmer meant, about the wood telling you what it wanted to be, except she'd come to believe it applied just as much to people as it did to lumber. She'd been 49 years old with a mortgage, no husband, and no job, and by most measures of the county that made her a write-off too. Nobody had offered her 11 cents a board. The helper she'd trained, a man named Roy Detweiler, who'd spent 14 years running a planer at a mill in Chippewa Falls before it shut down, eventually took over the wholesale side of the business almost entirely. The cutting boards, the planter boxes for the garden center, the steady weekly rhythm that paid the bills, while Deb worked her way down the 11-month custom list. Roy had his own failures learning the trade, plenty of them, the same way she had, and she found herself repeating Elmer's lines back to him, almost word for word, surprised each time at how naturally they came out, and surprised, too, at how much better she understood them in the saying than she ever had in the hearing. The $400 Gary Felt paid her that first autumn had long since stopped mattering as a number. What mattered, when she counted it honestly, was the 4,200 crates themselves, and what became of them. Something like 1,100 finished pieces of furniture over 4 years, 3 standing restaurant accounts, a wholesale line carried in 2 garden centers, an online order book that never fully emptied, and a public park in the town that had once employed her, built from the very wood that town had thrown away. The fire hazard the county worried about had become, instead, the only thing on her 40 acres anybody still talked about, and the talk had changed entirely from what it was that first frosty week when the trucks came through and dumped their loads and drove off without looking back. Deb kept the coffee cans of pulled nails lined up on a shelf in the drying barn, dozens of them by then, each one a rough marker of a season's worth of work. She never got around to actually counting the total, though she guessed at it sometimes for visitors who asked. It didn't much matter. What mattered was that every one of those nails had come out of a board somebody else had thrown on a burn pile, and every board had gone on to hold something up: a tabletop, a bench, a hutch, a child's christening gift, a name carved into a park memorial for people who used to pick apples for a living in a town that didn't grow them anymore. She figured that was a fair use for 4,200 crates and $400, and most days, standing in the barn with the smell of cut pine and old stencil ink still faintly in the air, she figured it was a fair use for the last part of her life too.